Boring history for sleep, vertical bar, how to survive Victorian London, and more. In the hush of a world lit only by fire, where shadows dance on crumbling walls, imagine waking to the weight of survival, not in the glow of a palace, but in a corner of Victorian London, where fog chokes the air and hope clings to the edges of a tattered blanket. Picture a single room, damp and creaking, shared with 6 others. Your family, your world, where a rat scurries like an uninvited guest, and the window traps more soot than light. Or step further back, to a medieval village, where winter's breath steals the last of your barley, and hunger whispers cruel promises in the dark. These are not just stories. They are lives gritty, raw, pulsing with quiet defiance. From the stench of a chamber pot, to the ache of a healer's herb-stained hands, from the terror of a plague-ridden street, to the fragile warmth of a shared loaf, this tapestry of struggle and resilience pulls you in. Can you hear the creak of the floorboards? Feel the sting of coal smoke in your lungs? Let's wander deeper into these forgotten corners of history, where every day was a battle and every survival a triumph. Dim the lights, let the world fade, and step softly into the past its heartbeat is waiting. Imagine waking up in Victorian London, not in a grand townhouse with polished brass doorknobs, but in a single cramped room that's your entire world. The first thing you see is your brother's foot, inches from your face, grimy and twitching from some nightmare he's wrestling with. This room, it's not a bedroom, not a living room, it's just the room. You share it with 6 others. Your parents, your siblings, maybe a cousin or 2. There's one bed, lumpy and sagging, claimed by whoever collapses first. 2 chairs, wobbly and barely holding together, sit in the corner like they're daring you to trust them. And then there's the rat. He's practically family at this point, scurrying along the walls with such confidence you're half tempted to charge him rent. The walls are bare, not a scrap of wallpaper, just patches of damp plaster where something maybe hope used to be. The ceiling leaks when it rains, and sometimes when it doesn't, dripping something you've decided not to question. The fireplace, it's fake, a cruel tease that gives no warmth. The air is heavy, damp, like breathing through a wet cloth. The floor creaks with every step, each groan reminding you that this place is as tired as you are. Your blanket is thin, wool, scratchy, probably hasn't been washed since the Crimean War. Your pillow, straw, lumpy, and you're pretty sure there's a sock in there somewhere, lost to time. There's no plumbing, of course. That bucket in the corner, it's your toilet, your bath, and in desperate times, your water source. You've learned to breathe through your mouth in the mornings. It cuts the stench just enough to bear. There's one window, if you can call it that, so caked in soot and grime it barely lets in light. Just the muffled sounds of the city, cartwheels rattling, vendors shouting about eels or cabbages, and someone 3 doors down coughing like they're trying to hack up their soul. You don't dare open that window. It looks out onto an alley where the butcher dumps his offcuts and your neighbor keeps his goat, which bleats at all hours like it's got a personal grudge. Mornings are a chaotic dance. You all shuffle around, dodging each other in the dim light, dressing under blankets to fend off the cold that seeps through the walls. The wash basin is a shared treasure, passed around like a prize in a grim game of musical chairs. Someone always knocks over the chamber pot, and the curses that follow are as routine as the sunrise. But somehow, this room, this miserable, creaking, leaking box, is home. You know every inch of it. The floorboard that squeaks like a warning, the corner that drips no matter the weather, the window pane that rattles just before your neighbor starts yelling about his stolen boots. There's a strange comfort in that familiarity, a sense of belonging stitched into the dust and the damp. It's not cozy, not by a long shot. It's not cute or quaint. This room is a crucible, toughening you up for the world outside, because trust me, the streets of Victorian London are no kinder. Step outside, and it's like walking into a wall of fog. Not the soft, romantic mist you read about in novels, but the infamous pea souper, a thick, choking haze born from coal smoke and damp air. It's like trying to breathe through a sock stuffed with ash. The sky is gray, the street is gray, even the air feels gray, clinging to your skin, seeping into your lungs, and leaving your clothes streaked with soot. You can barely see the end of your arm, and that shape ahead could be a lamppost, could be a horse. You cough. It's involuntary, part of the city's soundtrack, alongside church bells and the clatter of hooves. Everyone coughs. Children sound like lifelong smokers. Old men rattle windows with their hacking. The smell is a nightmare bouquet: chimney soot, sewage, horse manure, and the faint, lingering ghost of last night's cabbage. This fog doesn't just obscure, it brands you, marks you as a Londoner, daring you to keep breathing. This is just the start, friends. We haven't even hit the streets proper yet, where every step is a gamble, and survival is its own kind of victory. So, stick with me. Let the hum of the fan pull you deeper, and let's wander further into this gaslit, grimy world together. By the time February drags itself into being, the world around you has settled into a kind of quiet desperation. Winter's grip is still tight, and spring is only a rumor, something you cling to in the same way you clutch your last bit of dried beans or sour turnip. The days are ever so slightly longer, but they feel heavier somehow, colder, not in temperature necessarily, but in mood. The excitement of the first frost is long gone. What's left is the waiting, and wondering if what's left in your cellar will last, wondering if this will be the year that hunger hits harder than usual. See, in the medieval world, food wasn't a convenience. It was a calculation, a delicate balancing act between what you could grow, what you could preserve, and how long you could stretch it through the dead months. Autumn was all about preparation. You harvested everything that could possibly be eaten: grains, legumes, root vegetables, fruits, even nuts. Then came the butchering. If you were lucky enough to own a pig or a few chickens, they didn't get names. They got salted, smoked, hung up in the rafters where the rats couldn't reach. Meat wasn't for pleasure. It was insurance. But even with all that, you knew deep down it wouldn't be enough. The cellar becomes your quiet enemy. You go down there every day, not just for supplies, but to take stock. You run your hands along the bags of barley, the crocks of sauerkraut, the smoked hams if you have any left, and each time something has shrunk. The sacks have softened, the roots have withered, the jars are a little lower. What was once a bounty is now a countdown, and there's no going back. Nothing grows right now, not even weeds. You've already started rationing weeks ago, probably. Thinner stews, more water in the porridge, bread stretched with whatever filler you can find. Oat husks, acorn flour, sometimes even sawdust, if things get bad enough. Your stomach gets used to being half full. It grumbles, then stops grumbling. It becomes a quiet ache you learn to carry, like a splinter under your ribs. And what do you eat? It changes you. The taste of winter food is honest. That's a generous way to put it. There are no sweet things, unless you've managed to hoard some honey, and even that is used sparingly. Vegetables are pickled to the point of sourness. Grains are chewy, fibrous, and sometimes a little moldy. The beans are dry, the onions soft. You learn to chew slowly, not just to make it last, but because it's hard to swallow food that your body doesn't really want. Sometimes, it feels like you're eating just to keep your soul tethered to your body. You're not eating to enjoy. You're eating not to disappear. The real horror doesn't start with hunger. It starts with hopelessness, because it's not just your cellar that's emptying. It's the village. One by one, people start to weaken. The old first, then the young, then everyone else in between. You start to hear fewer voices in the fields, fewer footsteps on the snow-packed paths. The blacksmith's fire doesn't burn so often. The church bell rings a little more. Someone's gone again. No fanfare, just a quiet burial in frozen earth, and a little less food being used in their house. It's morbid, but it's a truth you learn not to flinch from. And this is what the medieval mind had to wrestle with every year. The idea that no matter how hard you worked in summer, no matter how carefully you stored and rationed, winter still might win. There wasn't always a clear line between bad luck and bad planning. Sometimes your crops fail. Sometimes the smokehouse leaked and all your meat spoiled. Sometimes you did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Hunger didn't care about effort. It only cared about math. If you had neighbors, you might trade some beans for a bit of dried apple, a jar of pickled cabbage for a small measure of salt. But no one has much to spare. Not now. The generosity of November has turned to quiet caution. No one wants to be the fool who gave away the last of their flour. There are no stores, no charity kitchens, no safety net. If the priest shares from the tithe barn, it's a rare act of mercy, not a right. Everyone is hungry, everyone is afraid. But even in all this, there's resilience. It's a quiet, worn kind of strength, stitched into the very bones of the people who live like this. They've known nothing else. Their parents starved. Their grandparents starved. And yet, here they are, still scraping bark from trees to make bitter tea, still boiling bones for broth one more time, still planting the first seeds of hope in frozen soil. Even when they know those seeds might not make it, you start to see beauty in survival. The way a mother hands her child the bigger piece of bread, pretending she's already eaten. The way a neighbor leaves a turnip on someone's doorstep in the dead of night. No note, no glory. The way stories are told around the fire not to entertain, but to remind each other that spring has come before, that it will come again. And it will, eventually. But first, you have to get through March. Then the cruel joke of April, where the snow melts but nothing grows. And finally, when the air softens and the ground opens its arms again, then you begin again, digging, planting, praying, hoping that this time, maybe the crops won't fail. Maybe the cellar will stay full a little longer. Maybe next winter won't take so much. But that's a long way off. For now, it's just another day in the long shadow of winter. You scrape your bowl clean, stretch your legs by the fire, and thank whatever God you believe in that there's still something left to eat tomorrow, because tomorrow is coming. If hunger is the quiet thief that steals your strength, then filth is its loud, brash cousin, the one that kicks down the door and settles into every crevice of your life. And in the medieval world, filth wasn't something you could fully escape. It was part of the scenery, woven into the fabric of your home, your streets, your clothes, and even your skin. Now, let's be clear. Medieval people weren't oblivious to dirt. They weren't wandering around in some joyous muckfest, completely unaware that things smelled bad. They noticed. They grumbled. They gagged, sometimes. But the issue wasn't a lack of awareness. It was a lack of infrastructure. Because when you live in a house with a dirt floor, share a room with your animals, and get your water from a stream that also serves as a toilet upstream, well, let's just say you learned to live with a little grime. Bathing wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't daily, not even close. In fact, if you were lucky enough to bathe once a month, congratulations, you were already ahead of the game. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, sure, but they were expensive and often frowned upon by the church, especially as their reputation slid from cleansing the body to tempting the flesh. For the average villager, a bath meant maybe a quick rinse in a cold stream during summer, or wiping yourself down with a damp cloth, assuming you could spare the water. Water was a strange paradox. Essential to life, yes, but also dangerous, because most of it wasn't clean. Wells could be safe if shallow and properly covered, but more often, your water came from shared sources: streams, rivers, ponds, and while they might look pretty in the morning light, those same waters carried every waste you could imagine: human, animal, industrial. Tanners dumped their chemicals, butchers their blood, and people? Well, when there's no toilet, the world becomes one, which brings us to the medieval latrine. Now, if you lived in a manor or a monastery, you might have had the luxury of a garderobe, essentially a stone toilet built into the wall, often hanging over a moat or pit. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. However, if you were just an ordinary peasant, your options were far more rustic. A wooden bench over a hole in the ground, sometimes shared between families, or, more commonly, just finding a quiet spot behind the house or in the woods. And if that wasn't enough indignity, you likely wiped yourself with moss, hay, or your hand. Paper wasn't a thing, not for wiping. Flies were constant companions. So were lice, fleas, worms. You didn't so much get parasites, you hosted them. They lived in your hair, your bedding, your clothes. Children were especially vulnerable. Their hair was often shaved short to keep lice down, but even that didn't always work. If you had an itch behind your ear, you didn't complain. You just scratched. Quietly. Clothes were rarely washed, mostly because it was such a monumental task. No running water, no detergent, no washing machine. Just cold, soapy water. If you had soap and a lot of scrubbing, maybe you'd take your garments to a river and beat them with rocks or soak them in lye, but more often than not, you just wore them until they wore out. Underclothes might be rinsed once in a while, but outer garments, weeks, sometimes months. It was just part of life, and with all that dirt came disease. Now, the medieval world didn't understand germs. Not really. They believed in miasma, bad air, and imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you got sick, maybe your blood was too hot, or your phlegm was out of balance. Cures involved bleeding, purging, or forcing vomit. Herbs helped sometimes, but medicine was more about ritual and tradition than science. Still, people weren't stupid. They noticed patterns. That sickness came after bad smells, that cramped cities were more dangerous than open fields, that rats carried something with them they just didn't know what. When the Black Death came, it tore through villages like a curse. Entire families are gone in a week. Mass graves, bells tolling without end. People wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, trying to filter out the bad air. It helped nothing. But even in non-plague years, sickness was never far. Dysentery from dirty water, typhoid from spoiled food. Tuberculosis passed in the crowded air of shared cottages. A simple wound could turn septic in days. Childbirth was a gamble. So was winter fever. So was drinking from the wrong bucket. To stay alive, you relied on instinct, old wives' tales, and prayer. Maybe you wore a charm. Maybe you chewed garlic. Maybe you visited a healer, an old woman with a cupboard of dried leaves and the knowledge passed from her grandmother's grandmother. Sometimes she helped. Sometimes you just died anyway. But still, people endured. They swept their dirt floors. They changed straw mattresses when they could. They hung herbs above the door, burned sage in the corners, combed their hair with fine-toothed bone combs to catch lice. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't even health by our standards, but it was survival. And in all of this, there was a strange kind of order. You knew the smells, you recognized the coughs, you knew which sores were harmless and which were not. You lived in a world where death was familiar, not feared, but expected. You learned to appreciate the days you weren't coughing, the mornings you could breathe clearly, the years you made it through winter without burying someone. Hygiene, in the medieval sense, wasn't about being clean. It was about being clean enough to keep the flies away, enough to avoid the worst fevers, enough to stay alive just a little longer. And somehow, through all the dirt, all the lice, and all the sickness, life kept going. Children were born, songs were sung, people laughed at their own smells, and told stories by the fire, scratching at their skin and sipping thin broth from a shared bowl. Because even in the filth, there was family, there was routine, and there was the quiet, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little less dirty than today. In the medieval world, where the wind carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, survival was a daily act of defiance. If you lived long enough to claw your way through hunger's sharp teeth and the filth that clung to your boots, there was another beast waiting in the shadows, just as fierce, just as unpredictable. Other people. In a village where every scrap of bread was counted, where a single stolen egg could mean the difference between a child's full belly and a night of tears, tempers flared like sparks on dry straw. And justice? Oh, justice was not the blind goddess of fairness you might imagine. It was a heavy, weathered thing, more about keeping the village from crumbling under its own desperation than about right or wrong. Picture a man named Edric, his hands calloused from years of pulling weeds and splitting logs. Edric wasn't wicked, not in his heart, but his daughter, little Alfwyn, had been coughing for weeks, her tiny body trembling under a threadbare blanket. The healer had no more herbs, and the Lord's taxes had taken the last of Edric's grain. Across the muddy path, his neighbor Godric kept chickens, their clucking a cruel taunt. One night, under a moonless sky, Edric crept into Godric's yard, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps. He took 3 eggs, no more, whispering to himself that he'd pay them back someday. He wasn't thinking about morality. He was thinking about Tuesday, when Alfwyn might not wake up without something warm in her belly. But Godric's wife saw him. By morning, the village buzzed with whispers, and Edric's name was on every tongue. Theft was common, not because people were cruel, but because they were cold, or hungry, or owed a debt they could never repay. Yet getting caught was a different story, one written in fear and shame. The punishment for even a small crime could be a spectacle, a lesson carved into the village's memory. If Edric was lucky, he'd face a fine a few pence, perhaps handed over with a bowed head. But Edric had no coin, only his labor and his shame. So the village reeve, a stern man with eyes like flint, sentenced him to the stocks. They stood in the village square, 2 wooden boards with holes for wrists and ankles, weathered by rain and the weight of countless others' mistakes. Locked in place, Edric sat, his head bowed, his body exposed to the chill of an autumn morning. The first jeers came from children, their voices high and mocking, poking at him with sticks. Then came the adults, some spitting, others tossing rotten cabbage or, worse, stones that left bruises blooming on his skin. The lesson hung in the air, heavy as fog. Don't steal. But for Edric, the lesson was something else. Survival came at a cost, and sometimes that cost was your dignity. The stocks were only the beginning. For those who stole again, or whose crimes were deemed greater, the punishments grew sharper, more permanent. A repeat offender might face branding a hot iron pressed to the hand or cheek, searing a mark that screamed thief to anyone who saw it. In some regions, it was a T for theft. In others, a simple cross, but the meaning was universal. You were a walking warning, your shame etched into your flesh. Edric's cousin Wulfric had such a mark, a puckered scar on his palm from a stolen sack of barley years ago. Wulfric never spoke of it, but his eyes darkened when anyone stared too long at his hand. For the worst crimes, murder, serious theft, or treason, death waited, not quiet or private, but loud, public, a performance. Hangings drew crowds, sometimes hundreds, gathering in the market square or on a hill outside the village. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Women clutched rosaries. Men stood with arms crossed, their faces unreadable. It was grim entertainment, a reminder that one wrong step could be your last. The gallows creaked under the weight of the condemned, the ropes swaying in the wind. But hanging wasn't the only end. Some crimes called for more inventive punishments, ones that lingered in the village's nightmares. Take the ducking stool, used mostly for women, accused of gossip, witchcraft, or simply being difficult. A woman like Mildred, who spoke too freely about the Reeves' greed, might find herself tied to a wooden chair, her wrists bound with rough hemp. The crowd would gather by the river, their breath fogging in the winter air, as Mildred was dunked again and again into the icy water. The cold bit like 1,000 needles, the humiliation burned deeper, and the laughter of the crowd was a wound that never healed. It didn't always kill, but it wasn't meant to. It was meant to remind her and every other woman watching of her place. Then there was the scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head, its iron tongue pressing against the mouth to silence speech. This, too, was for women, not for crimes, but for transgressions. Talking too much, questioning the priest, being what the village called nasty. It was punishment dressed as control, a way to hush the loud, not the lawbreaker. When Aliana, the miller's widow, wore the bridle for arguing with the Lord Steward, she walked the village streets, her eyes blazing with defiance even as the metal bit into her skin. The village watched and learned. Silence was safer. Trials, when they happened, were rarely fair. The manorial court, held in a drafty barn or the church hall, was the Lord's domain. Here, disputes over land, unpaid rents, or broken oaths were settled, not by law books but by custom, memory, and sometimes grudges. Edric stood before the Lord's steward, his neighbors whispering behind him, Godric's wife glaring from the crowd. The steward listened, his quill scratching parchment, but his decision often hinged on who he favored or who had paid him last. If the Lord liked you, you might walk free. If he didn't, a broken fence could cost you half a year's earnings. And then there were the trials, by ordeal, reserved for those cases where guilt was uncertain and the village demanded a spectacle. Trial by fire meant grasping a red-hot iron or walking barefoot over glowing coals. Your wounds were bandaged, left for 3 days. If they festered, you were guilty. If they healed, God had declared you innocent. Trial by water was crueler still. Tied up and tossed into a pond, you floated if guilty, the pure water rejecting you. You sank if innocent, praying someone pulled you out before your breath gave way. These weren't stories. They were real, and they hung over the village like a storm cloud, especially for the poor, the powerless, the women, the ones who stepped on the wrong toes. Yet, despite the brutality, people came to the courts, sat through the accusations, the judgments, the punishments, because deep down, they knew, without some form of law, even a harsh one, chaos would reign, and in a world already teetering on the edge, order, however cruel, was better than none. So Edric taught Ælfwine to be quiet in church, to bow to the reeve, to run if the bailiff's shadow fell too close. He watched his neighbors, and prayed they weren't watching him, because justice in the medieval world wasn't blind. It had sharp, suspicious eyes, and it never forgot a face. When sickness came, as it often did, it slipped into the village like a thief, silent and uninvited. There were no hospitals to run to, no white-coated doctors with answers. The few hospitals that existed were more like almshouses, places for the dying to find a bed and a priest, not a cure. Healing, if it came at all, was a fragile patchwork thing, woven from herbs, prayers, and a stubborn will to live. Imagine Ælfwine again, her cough now a wet rasp, her small body curled under a blanket by the fire. Edric didn't call for a physician. There were none in their village, and even if there were, Their Latin and their fees were as distant as the stars. Instead, he sought old Winflade, the village healer, a woman whose hands were gnarled as oak roots and whose eyes held a quiet wisdom. Winflade wasn't trained, not in the way of university men, but she knew the names of plants and the prayers that went with them. She was trusted, and trust was worth more than knowledge. Winflade's hut smelled of earth and dried leaves, bundles of sage and nettle hanging from the rafters. She listened to Elfwin's cough, felt her forehead, and murmured something soft, almost a song. Then she set to work, grinding herbs with a mortar, mixing them with honey and vinegar. "This will ease her," she said, handing Edric a clay pot. "And pray to St. Roach tonight." Edric nodded, clutching the pot as if it were a relic. Healing in the medieval world rested on the ancient theory of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Balance meant health. Imbalance meant sickness. Aelfwin's fever suggested too much blood, so Winflade might have suggested bloodletting a cut on the arm or a leech behind the ear to draw out the excess. If her cough was phlegmy, it was too much phlegm, and a poultice of mustard and onion might be applied to her chest. Every symptom had a cause, every cause a remedy, though few of those remedies would survive a modern gaze. Treatments were a mix of the practical and the strange. Garlic and honey for wounds, wine-soaked bread as a poultice, even urine. Yes, urine to cleanse a cut. Some worked, by chance or by nature. Others did little but sting. Charms and prayers were just as vital. Sickness wasn't only physical. It could be a curse, a punishment, a test. So Edric whispered to Saint Apollonia for Aelfwin's toothache, to Saint Ro for her fever. He tied a scrap of cloth, said to have touched a saint's tomb, around her wrist, believing it might shield her. Sometimes it seemed to. Faith was a powerful medicine, blurring the line between body and soul. Monasteries were the closest thing to medical centers, their monks copying Latin texts from ancient physicians, tending herb gardens, treating the sick as a sacred duty. But even they were bound by the era's limits, their cures rooted in prayer as much as in plants. When Aelfwin's cough worsened, Edric took her to the nearby priory, where Brother Anselm, a monk with ink-stained fingers, gave her a bitter tea of wormwood and prayed over her for hours. "God's will," he said, and Edric nodded, though his heart ached for something more certain. Serious illness was a different beast. Buboes in the armpits, blood in the spit, a fever that wouldn't break. These were the harbingers of plague, tuberculosis, or festering wounds. There were no antibiotics, no surgeries, no understanding of germs. A broken bone might be set, if someone knew how. A toothache could turn deadly. A cut could rot into gangrene. A difficult birth could claim both mother and child. Yet people endured, not expecting miracles, only hoping to outlast the storm. When death came, as it often did, it was met with ritual. A priest would visit, murmuring last rites as neighbors gathered, their prayers a soft hum around the bed. Aelfwin mercifully recovered, her cough fading under Winflade's care and Edric's prayers. But others weren't so lucky. The churchyard grew crowded, each new grave marked with a candle, a cross, a hope that heaven was kinder than earth. Death was never far in the medieval world. It sat at the table, slept in the bed, and walked the fields. Children vanished to fevers, mothers to childbirth, men to wounds. Yet, life pressed on, stubborn as a weed. Another birth, another season, another prayer. Healing, imperfect and steeped in faith, was all they had. And somehow, in its fragile way, it was enough. If you were born a peasant, the clash of swords and the thunder of hooves were sounds from another world until they weren't. War was like a storm, its rumble distant at first, then crashing over your village with no warning. Lords feuded, kings died, borders shifted, and when war came, It didn't care if you were ready. It swept you up, a leaf in a gale, and thrust you into a chaos you barely understood. Picture young Cuthbert, a farmer's son with dirt under his nails and dreams of a quiet life. His world was the rhythm of the plow, the bleating of sheep, the warmth of his mother's hearth. But one spring, the Lord's bailiff rode into the village, his voice sharp as a blade. "The king calls for men," he said. "Cuthbert, son of Aelfric, you owe service." There was no choice. Refusal meant losing the family's land, their home, maybe their lives. So Cuthbert went, his mother's tears staining his cheek, a rusty spear thrust into his hands. The armies of the medieval world weren't sleek or professional. Knights, armored and mounted, were the elite, but they were few. Most soldiers were like Cuthbert farmers, laborers, smiths, conscripted by duty or desperation. His weapons were simple: a spear, a wooden shield, a helmet too big for his head, passed down from a dead uncle. A few men carried bows, long and deadly, but bows took skill Cuthbert didn't have. If he was lucky, he might have a short sword, but swords were for richer men. Cuthbert fought with what he had: a spear and a heart full of fear. Armor? He had none, only a padded gambeson, stiff with sweat and patched with coarse thread. Chainmail was for knights, plate armor a distant dream. He marched for weeks, sleeping on wet ground, eating stale bread and watery beer. Lice burrowed into his scalp, his boots chafed his feet raw, and the smell of unwashed men clung to the air. But so it was for everyone. And Cuthbert learned to endure. When the horns blew, signaling battle, his stomach twisted. The battlefield was no place of honor, no shining stage from a bard's tale. It was a muddy field, churned to slop by hooves and boots, reeking of sweat, dung, and fear. Cuthbert stood in a ragged line, his lord's voice booming commands he barely understood. The archers loosed first, arrows screaming through the air, a dark cloud that fell like judgment. Cuthbert didn't look up. He prayed, his lips moving silently as men around him fell, pierced and screaming. Then came the charge cavalry thundering forward, their armor glinting, smashing into the enemy like a wave against rock. Behind them, the foot soldiers surged, and Cuthbert was carried forward, his spear clutched tight. Combat was no dance, no strategy for a man like him. It was chaos, clumsy and brutal. He saw only the man before him, eyes wild, swinging a mace. Cuthbert thrust his spear, felt it bite, and heard a scream. The noise was deafening steel on bone, men crying, horses shrieking in a way that sounded too human. He swung, he stumbled. He prayed not to fall, because to fall was to die, crushed under boots or blades. Battles were short, an hour at most, but they felt eternal. The sun burned, the mud sucked at his feet, his arms trembled with exhaustion. Then, suddenly, it was over. The enemy broke, fleeing or dying in the grass. Victory was no triumph, only a mess of bodies, some still twitching, blood pooling in the dirt. The looting began with men like Cuthbert, rummaging for coins, weapons, anything of value. He found a dagger, its handle worn but sharp, and tucked it into his belt. The dead didn't need it. If you lost, survival was a gamble. Run, and you might escape. Stay, and you might be killed or captured. Prisoners were sometimes ransomed, if they were worth something. Cuthbert was no one, so he ran, his breath ragged, until he collapsed in a ditch, alive but haunted. Some weren't so lucky maimed, their hands or ears cut off, or simply left to rot. Why did men like Cuthbert go to war? Some had no choice, bound by their lord's command. Others went for coins, though they rarely came. Some for loot, some for pride, some because they believed in a king, a cause, or God. The Crusades, holy wars preached as righteous, drew thousands, knights and peasants alike. Cuthbert's uncle had gone, a cross sewn into his tunic, dreaming of Jerusalem. He never returned, yet the idea of a sacred war burned bright, especially in a world where death was ever present. For most, war was simply something that happened, like famine or flood. You endured it, buried your friends in shallow graves, and limped home, if home still stood. Cuthbert returned to his village, thinner, scarred, his eyes older than his years. His mother embraced him, saying nothing, because she'd seen it before. The fields waited, the sheep needed tending, the seasons marched on. War might pause, but survival never did. In the medieval world, peace was a fleeting guest, but survival was the truest king. Through justice's harsh hand, healing's fragile hope, and war's brutal chaos, life endured, stubborn and unbroken, a quiet song whispered in the dark. In the medieval world, you don't live without believing in something. Faith isn't a choice. It's the air you breathe, thick and ever-present, curling around your life like smoke from the hearth. It rises from the damp soil beneath your feet, whispers in the rustle of ancient trees, and hovers over your bed as you sleep, a silent guardian or a stern judge. God is not a distant idea, not a question to ponder. God is everywhere, in the flicker of a candle, the weight of a plow, the cry of a newborn. And the devil, too, lurks close if you're not vigilant, his shadow slipping through the cracks of a weary heart. Faith is survival, as vital as bread or fire. You pray before you sow the barley, your knees sinking into the cold earth, asking for a harvest that won't fail. You pray before you eat, even if it's just a crust of rye and a thin broth, thanking God for what little you have. You pray before you sleep, crossing yourself as the wind rattles the shutters, warding off the night's unseen dangers. Every cough that lingers too long, every swollen belly, every field blackened by blight, it all carries meaning. Nothing is merely natural. Sickness is a mark of sin, misfortune, a curse whispered in the dark. And miracles? They're rare, like stars breaking through a clouded sky, but never impossible. You've heard of a blind man who saw again after touching a saint's relic, a child who woke after a fever when her mother prayed through the night. You hold these stories close, like embers, because they promise hope. The church stands at the heart of your village, its stone walls weathered but unyielding, the only building not made of wattle and daub. Sometimes its arches are carved with saints' faces, sometimes it's crumbling at the edges, but it's always there, holding the soul of the people. Its bell rings across the fields, a voice that calls you not just on Sundays, but for every milestone: births, deaths, marriages, fasts, and feasts. You don't question its rhythm, you live by it, your days shaped by its tolling. On a quiet morning, when the mist clings to the ground, the bell feels like God himself speaking, steady and eternal. Mass is a mystery, and you're content with that. The priest chants in Latin, his words a river of sound you can't follow, but you don't need to. The ritual is what matters. The curl of incense, sharp and sweet, the flicker of candles, the priest's slow gestures as he lifts the host, the holy bread, the sip of wine, the story of Christ's suffering and resurrection. It's a language deeper than words. You kneel on the cold floor, your rough hands clasped, and you believe. And when belief falters, when doubt creeps in like a draft, fear steps in to steady you. Fear of God's judgment, of the devil's snares, of a life unmoored from meaning. That's enough to keep you bowing, praying, returning. Saints are your companions, each with a purpose as specific as a tool. Saint Apollonia eases toothaches, her name a whisper when pain stabs your jaw. Saint Anthony finds lost things, A spoon, a coin, a wandering sheep. Saint Isidore watches over farmers, his name on your lips as you plow the stubborn earth. You carry their tokens if you can. A chipped medallion of Saint Christopher for safe journeys, a scrap of cloth blessed at a shrine, a splinter of wood said to come from the true cross, though you've never seen the relic itself. These are your shields, small but heavy with hope, anchoring you in a world where chaos waits at every turn. But not all spirits wear halos. Beyond the church's shadow, older fears linger, stories your grandmother told by the fire, her voice low as if the walls might listen. Tales of things that walk at night, their footsteps soft as fog, of creatures that scratch at the walls, of woods that murmur names when the moon is dark. You hang garlic by the door, not because the priest approves, but because it feels right. On certain nights, you mark the threshold with ash, a quiet act of defiance against whatever might cross it. The old ways never died. They learned to wear crosses, to blend with the psalms, to live in the spaces between prayers. Monks and friars drift through your village, their feet bare, their robes patched, their eyes alight with a strange, quiet peace. They speak of penance, of Christ's love, of suffering as a path to grace. Sometimes they lay hands on the sick, their prayers rising like a song, and a fever breaks. Sometimes they offer only stories of martyrs, of miracles, of a kingdom beyond this world. You listen, your hands still from churning butter or mending nets, and you offer what you can, a heel of bread, a clutch of eggs. You never turn them away. Who knows which one might be a saint in disguise, testing your heart? The church isn't always gentle. Its love can sting. A neighbor caught threshing grain on a holy day might stand before the village, head bowed, as the priest names his shame. A woman like old Winflade, who knows too many herbs and speaks too boldly, might be accused of witchcraft, her wrists bound, her back lashed. The line between healing and heresy is thin as a spider's thread, and you tread carefully, watching what you say, what you do. Confession is your safety net. You kneel in the dim church, the air heavy with wax and guilt, and spill your sins, pride, envy, a stolen egg, a curse muttered under your breath. Sometimes you add a sin you didn't commit, just to be safe. The priest listens, his face hidden in shadow, and absolves you. You say your penance 5 Our Fathers, 10 Hail Marys, and leave, clean for now, though sin, like dust, settles back quickly. Feast days are the bright threads in the tapestry of your life. Easter, with its dawn hymns and eggs dyed red. Christmas, with its firelit songs and a rare taste of meat. Candlemas, when you carry a taper through the dark, its flame a tiny defiance against winter. All Saints' Day, when the dead feel close, their names whisper in prayers. These days are more than holy. They're lifelines. You wear your best tunic, patched but clean, and eat better barley stew thickened with peas, perhaps a honeyed cake. You sing until your voice cracks, drink ale until the world softens, laugh until your sides ache. For a moment, the weight of survival lifts, and the world feels whole. Lent, though, is the shadow to those lights. 40 days of fasting, of giving up what little you have. No meat, no butter, no ale, just bread, broth, and the ache of hunger. You pray more, your knees bruised from kneeling, your thoughts turned inward. It's hard, and that's the point. Hardship carves a path to Christ, the priest says, and you nod, chewing your dry bread, enduring as you always do. The hunger feels like a prayer, each pang a step closer to grace. Pilgrimages are dreams for most, but you know someone who walked to Canterbury, his feet blistered, his heart seeking forgiveness for a sin he never named. Another went to Santiago, returning quieter, his eyes distant but calm. Rome is a story, too far to believe, but you admire those who go, and maybe envy them, their courage to leave the village's familiar mud for a miracle. Most never stray far, but the idea of a journey, of a holy destination, sparks something in you, a longing for more than this field, this hut, this life. Relics are whispered wonders, a bone of St. Peter, a vial of Mary's milk, a feather said to be an angel's. You don't ask for proof. Faith doesn't need it. You kneel before the relic, your hands trembling, and pray. When your daughter's fever breaks the next day, or your cow walks again, you don't question. It's enough. Holy days are marked by more than prayers. Processions wind through the fields, the priest in his robes, children carrying candles, old women clutching rosaries. You walk, chanting, asking God to bless the crops. It's beautiful, the banners fluttering, the voices rising, but it's terrifying too. One frost, one flood, and you're begging again. Faith is not comfort. It's a necessity, a rope you cling to in the storm. Death is ever present, a guest who never leaves. A child's cough turns to silence, a cut festers, a winter steals the weak. But death is a passage, not an end. You bury your dead in the churchyard, the earth holy, the prayers rising like smoke. You light candles, their flames trembling with hope for heaven, fear of purgatory, dread of hell. You keep praying, for them, for you, for a world that holds you close. In every moment baking bread, weathering storms, meeting the priest's gaze, there's a prayer to live, to endure, to find meaning. God is in the mud under your nails, the fire warming your hands, the blood in your veins. The divine is woven into every breath, every silence, always watching, always near. And you, with your small, stubborn faith, keep walking through it all. You never really stop being afraid of sickness. It comes quietly, sometimes overnight, like a cold wind under the door. First, it's a cough. Then, it's a shiver, or a rash, or a swelling you can't explain. And then, someone is dead. Or worse, not dead, but still suffering, screaming, changing. You don't have the words for most of what's happening inside a body. You just know when something's wrong. And when it is, there's very little you can do about it. Illness doesn't just hurt. It terrifies, because it feels like punishment. You think, what did I do wrong? Maybe it was missing mass. Maybe it was stealing a little bread. Or maybe you crossed someone without knowing, and now they've cursed your house. You look for reasons, for patterns, for anything to explain why your child is burning up with fever or why your neighbor's skin has turned black. And when the plague comes, there's no logic at all. Just fear and silence and bodies buried before sunset. Most healing begins at home. The women in your life, your mother, your wife, your old aunt who smells of herbs, they know a bit. Not magic, not quite medicine, but things passed down in whispers. Honey for cuts, chamomile for sleep, onion for fever, wine, if you're lucky enough to have it, to wash wounds, and prayer, always prayer. You sit beside the sick, and you whisper the Lord's Prayer until your voice gives out, because you don't know what else to do. And then there's the village healer, maybe called a wise woman, maybe something less kind. She knows more, she's seen more. She can mix up poultices that smell awful but sometimes help. She knows which plants to boil, which to chew, which to bury at the crossroads. Some say she's a witch, some say she's a gift from God. You go to her when the priest can't help and when you're desperate enough to risk being seen. But the line between healer and heretic is thin, too thin. If she cures too many people, people whisper. If she fails too often, they accuse. And if she speaks too boldly, they remember the flames they saw once in the next village over. So she keeps her head down, She gives what she can. She lives carefully, always one bad rumor away from ruin. Then there's the barber surgeon. If you're in a larger town, he cuts hair, pulls teeth, lances, boils. He might own a few rusty tools, a knife, a saw, a cautery iron. If you've got money, he might bleed you, as they say, to balance your humor. You don't understand what that means exactly, but it sounds serious and painful and a little exciting. Maybe it works, maybe it kills you. You try anyway, because dying slow in bed feels worse than rolling the dice on something that might fix what's wrong. The idea of humor is everywhere in medicine. You've heard the words blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. If they're out of balance, the body breaks. That's what the learned men say. So they bleed you. They give you leeches. They feed you hot foods for cold sicknesses, cold foods for hot ones. You don't argue. They have books, Latin ones. They must know something you don't. Still, no one really knows where illness comes from. Some say it's the bad air, miasma. So during outbreaks, people burn herbs and flowers. They hold sweet-smelling things to their noses to keep the poison out. Others say it's the stars, a bad alignment, a curse in the sky, or maybe it's judgment, divine punishment for sin. That idea makes the most sense to you. Everything is a test, everything is a trial, and if someone dies, maybe they deserved it. Maybe you will too. The worst is when plague arrives, real plague, the Black Death, though you don't call it that yet. You just call it pestilence or death. It starts with a lump, a swelling, a burning fever. People fall like wheat, whole families gone in a week. Priests stop visiting. People stop burying the dead. Sometimes they flee. But where would you go? The disease moves faster than you ever could. And besides, you wouldn't want to carry it to another village. That would be worse than dying here. You burn straw beds, clothes, whole houses. You isolate the sick if you can, locking them away, listening through the door until the sounds stop. Some think cats or dogs spread the plague, and they're killed by the hundreds, but it doesn't help. The fleas are already on you. The sickness is already in your blood. The fear becomes something physical. It changes how people look at each other. A cough becomes a death sentence. A blotchy rash sends neighbors scattering. You start to believe in curses again, in demons, in invisible hands pulling strings above the village. And when it's all over, when the deaths slow down, you look at the world differently, quieter, smaller, more breakable. Afterward, the survivors gather what's left. Children without parents, fields without farmers, graves without names, and life goes on. Somehow, the healer disappears. The priest drinks more. The village feels haunted, and yet the bread still needs baking. The cows still need milking. So you rise, wipe the ashes from your shoes, and keep walking. Death is no longer a visitor. It lives among you now. But so does resilience, so does endurance. You do not understand why some lived and some didn't, but you're still here. And in a way, that's all the explanation you'll ever get. And so the year turns, soft and relentless, like a millstone grinding grain, like a lullaby you hum to a restless child. Winter fades, spring wakens, summer hums, autumn sighs each season with its own voice, its own demands, its own fleeting gifts. You don't have a calendar, not like the lords with their parchment and quills, their dates etched in Latin. You don't need one. The world tells you what time it is. You feel it in the ache of your knuckles when frost bites the ground. You smell it in the sharp tang of spring mud, the heavy sweetness of summer hay, the crisp decay of fallen leaves. You see it in the bare branches, the newborn lambs, the geese stitching their way across a gray sky. This is your clock, your almanac, written in earth and air and bone. There's no future here, not the kind the rich chase with their plans and promises. No dreams of climbing ladders or hoarding coins for a distant tomorrow. Your world is this village, nestled in the land's quiet folds like a secret whispered between hills. You don't expect change, not for you, not for your children, not for the cluster of thatched roofs that hold your life. But hopelessness? That's not your burden. You live differently, that's all. You find joy in the smallest cracks of the day. The warmth of fresh bread crumbling in your hands, the cold rush of a stream over your bare feet, the way sunlight spills across the church's wooden floor, golden and silent when the priest is gone. You smile when your son, barely 4, wraps his tiny hand around your thumb, his grip fierce and trusting. These are your treasures, and they are enough. Survival is more than outlasting winter's claws. It's a way of being, a rhythm you carry in your chest. You plan only as far as the next harvest, counting your days in sheaves of wheat, loaves baked, candles burned to stubs. You're not lazy, not simple, as the monks with their books might think. You're attuned, body and soul, to the land's pulse, the churn of mud under your boots, the rustle of barley in a storm, the stillness of a frozen morning. You know when to sow because the blackthorn blooms. You know when to reap because the moon hangs low and fat. Your wisdom is not written, but it is deep, carved into you by years of watching, listening, enduring. Some days stretch long and heavy, each hour a weight on your shoulders. You rise before dawn, your breath fogging in the dark, to milk the cow, whose udder is worryingly small this spring. You mend the fence the wind tore down, your fingers numb from the cold. You knead dough, chop wood, carry water, all while questions gnaw at you. Will the barley sprout? Will the cow survive her calving? Will the river flood again, as it did 3 years ago, swallowing half the fields? Other days vanish in a blur of small tasks, sharpening a scythe, weaving a basket, sitting by the fire as rain drums the roof, waiting for the sky to clear. Sometimes, life feels less like living and more like enduring, a slow march through a world that offers no ease. But even endurance has its quiet pride. It's a heroism no one sees, no one sings of, but you feel it in your bones when you lie down at night, weary but unbroken. Comfort is not a word you know well. It's not soft beds or fine cloaks, as the Lord's wife might have. Comfort is a stomach that doesn't growl, a roof that doesn't leak, shoes that hold together through another winter. It's an afternoon when your back doesn't ache, when you wake without the cough that's haunted you since the last frost. It's your daughter, Ethel fled, laughing again, her cheeks pink after a fever that kept you praying through 3 sleepless nights. These are your riches, and you count them like a miser counts gold, knowing how rare they are, how fleeting. There are moments rare, sacred when the world softens, and you feel something like peace. The church bells ring on a Sunday morning, their sound rolling over the fields like a blessing. Snow falls, muffling the village into a silence so deep it feels holy. You share a warm drink with neighbors after a funeral, your hands cupped around a wooden bowl, the steam curling like a prayer. You notice everything. The moon's slow waxing, the way the wind shifts before a storm, the pattern of frost on your window, delicate as lace. You may not read or write, but you are wise in ways no scholar could match. You know the land's moods, its warnings, its gifts. You see the world, and it sees you back. Death is no stranger. It visits too often, slipping into your home like an uninvited guest. You've buried infants, their tiny bodies wrapped in linen, so small they barely left a mark on the world. You've held the hands of friends Godric, who shared his ale with you as boys, Eliana, who sang as she spun wool watching their breath falter, their eyes dim. You've seen the strong felled by fevers, the weak outlive them all, defying logic. Grief lives with you, a shadow that never fully sleeps, but you've learned to carry it, to let it weave itself into your story. It doesn't break you. It bends you, shapes you, makes you softer in places you didn't expect. And still, you rise, you walk, you plant the next season's seeds. Faith is your anchor, even when doubt creeps in, as it does in the long, cold nights. You kneel in the church, your knees pressing into the cold stone, and light a candle, its flame trembling like your hope. You walk through snow to hear the priest's words, not because you always believe, but because you need the ritual, the story, the promise of something beyond this aching world. They say heaven waits, a place of rest and light. You want to believe it, but sometimes heaven feels closer, not in the sky, but here, in the sharp sweetness of the first summer plum, in the warmth of Ethelfled's hand in yours, in the quiet of a chapel at dawn, lit only by a single ray of sun. Your name won't be written in history's grand books. The scribes will speak of kings, wars, plagues, and revolts, their ink blind to you, but you are not nothing. You are the soil that holds the kingdom's roots. You pull the cart, till the field, and bake the bread. Without you, there is no feast, no crown, no cathedral's soaring stone. You are the unseen pulse, the quiet strength that keeps the world turning. Your life matters not in glory, but in the meals shared, the children raised, the fields tended through drought and storm. It matters in your stubborn refusal to stop, even when no one watches, even when the wheel feels too heavy to push. And now, the year turns again. Snow melts into rivulets. Birds return with their restless songs. The air smells of wet earth and possibility. You stretch your arms, sore but alive, and lift your face to the pale sun. The wheel keeps moving, and you've forgotten, unrecorded, unnamed to keep walking. That is a miracle. That is the story. And it is far from over.